This week I'm returning to my sampling project for a that was a recovery from a mistake I made in substituting yarn colors. I thought I had plenty of my lighter color zephyr yarn, the wool silk, enough for both warp and weft, and it turned out I used almost all of it up in the warp. So I wound more chains in a different colorway, but I didn't want to waste all this. So you may recall that I warped up my loom with this, planning to make just a simple fabric, actually to sample a bunch of different fabrics, and then weave enough for a wrap cardigan that I've made before and that I really love. You may also recall that I had a bunch of errors going on when I took my warp chains off the warping board. So I had to adjust how I warped this to fix those color errors because the color pattern in this fabric is so distinct. So right now I want to review the mistakes I was trying to recover from and how well or not those recoveries went. But before I look at the fabric, look at my weaving, look at anything else, I want to say a word about using pirns on end delivery shuttles. Okay, so here is my end delivery shuttle, and I love using these. They make your selvages so nice and even with very little effort. But one of the things you do have to be careful about is how you wind your pirn, because if you do it poorly, you're going to have trouble getting the yarn to come off of it smoothly. So the mistake I made this time, so when you wind a pirn for an end delivery shuttle, you do it in sections. You do up to here and build it up, and then you go up to here and you build it up, et cetera, et cetera. And this is what allows the yarn to come smoothly off the pirn as the shuttle is traveling through your warp. And if you do it badly, like if you cross over, that causes problems. But the thing I discovered on this particular pirn, and only this one, is that I had wound too much yarn at the back of the pirn, where the pirn is actually flared out anyway. And the problem this caused, and I've done this before on boat shuttle bobbins, where I've just wound too much onto the bobbin. And so when I try to run the shuttle along the shuttle race, instead of the wood making contact with the shuttle race, the yarn is making contact. Well, on a boat shuttle bobbin, yeah, you might have a couple of wonky passes where the shuttle isn't moving as quickly as you'd expected it to, just because there's yarn in the way. But on a boat shuttle bobbin, the yarn's going to wind off quickly. On a pirn, it is absolutely not going to wind off quickly. I'm not going to reach this area where there's too much yarn until the pirn is almost empty. So it's just a word of warning that when you're winding a pirn on your bobbin winder, it might be useful to have the shuttle next to you and just check that the height of the yarn on the pirn, and you can just barely see it here, that the height of the yarn is not getting higher than the sides of your end delivery shuttle. So that's a tip from me that now I've learned the hard way, just to make life a little easier for your weaving. Okay, now let's look at this fabric. And I'm going to be stopping and starting and trying not to make you all seasick because I adjust the camera here. So here's the first situation I had to deal with this particular project. I was totally out to lunch when I wound these warp chains and messed up the color pattern, as you may recall. And kind of casually, sort of noticed when I was putting the ends of the chains onto my apron bar, which is lashed to another apron bar, which is then connected to the warp beam. I'd kind of sort of noticed, oh, maybe that doesn't look quite right as I was doing that, but I didn't pay any attention until I'd gotten the whole thing warped up and ready to weave, and then went, oh, that's really a problem. So as I showed in another video, I actually wound a new warp chain with the section that I'd missed, which was 16 threads wide. So it was a significant amount of warpage. Then I tied up 16 string heddles on my shafts so that I could fill in the gap because I hadn't left any open heddles on these shafts. And then uh, unbeamed the whole warp, fixed the section, well, inserted the section that needed to be inserted, and then tied everything off. And on this particular section, because I did not want to take all these ends of the chains off and put them on again, I just tied on with a tie-up cord, an extra tie-up cord. So let's look now at how well or not that worked from the opposite side of the loom. And I am pleased to report that it actually worked pretty ding-dang well. You can see which section I um, warped in, for lack of a better word. I'm not sure there's any phrase for what I did because most people hopefully wouldn't be lame enough to actually do this. But it has worked pretty well. I have noticed slight tension differences as I've woven, but it hasn't been anything significant, and that is really great. So at the moment, I have just advanced my warp, and you can see a slight bulge in this section. But once I tighten up a little bit more, it pretty much goes away, and I haven't had any significant problems with this weird section, this wonky section that I added in after I had warped up the whole loom, which is great. So ultimately, I just decided to weave off the entire 4.5 yard warp in a plain weave pattern. I had set up the loom so that I could change treadling patterns if I wished to in different types of twills. I had done a straight draw warping where the threading just goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 all the way across. Um, and I tried a twill at the beginning of this, and I didn't like it because what was happening was these bright gray stripes that set off the alternating sections of tencel, um, they were getting lost because a twill has such a marked diagonal progression that these were just getting lost. And I'll show you this after I take the fabric off the loom. Uh, so I did it all plain weave. And despite how very, very fine this yarn is, it has woven up so very quickly. Uh, it's been kind of astonishing how quickly this fabric at 4.5 yards has woven up. I will be done in another half hour and I will take it off the loom. So since what I'm going to need for my cardigan is 91 inches and I've woven 4.5 yards, which is rather more than 91 inches, I am going to do something kind of fun. And yes, I will show you the results when I have them to show. So when I am done weaving off the warp, I will hem stitch to protect the weft, and then I will just cut so that there's a narrow edge, and then I will take this fabric to my sewing machine, and I'll do probably a foot to start with. I will measure a foot of woven fabric along the selvage, and I will run 2 rows of zigzag stitching right next to each other at that point, and then I'll cut between those rows. And that will give me a sample to test wet finish. As you may recall, this fabric has a mix. This lighter blue color is wool silk, which has a lot of stretch and will shrink it under certain conditions. And the tencel yarns, the darker blue and light blue, which are always done in, oh, and the gray is also the zephyr, the wool silk. These alternating sections are tencel, which are not going to shrink. And I want to play with different finishing methods to see how they're going to turn out. So if I make a sample fabric of 12 inches lengthwise on the grain and finish it, I will then be able to tell what finishing methods I should use for the fabric for my cardigan, my wrap cardigan. And so just taking 12 inches at a time, and I need to be pretty consistent about it. And I will need to have measured both the width of this fabric and the length of the fabric before wet finishing so I can allow for shrinkage. I'll be able to play and see what happens if, for instance, I just soak a sample in hot water or soak another sample in hot water and then alternate it with a cold water bath, which is how I generally shrink wool fabrics or wool yarns when I want a hard finish on my hand spun. And a third sample, and I should have plenty of fabric to do this. I'm going to let soak and then wrap it in a towel so that it and the towel are damp, and just run it in the dryer for any number of minutes. I truly do not know what is going to happen to my fabric, and that is like going commando. If I had sampled this before I wove all the length of the warp off, I would have a much clearer idea of going to uh, what I was going to end up with. But I didn't, and so now I get to experiment and play and see what different methods are going to do to this finished cloth. I am exceptionally happy with how well this project has turned. My salvages, because I used an end delivery shuttle, are quite good. I'd give myself maybe A minus B plus as a grade for these salvages, and just the bold graphic nature of this fabric is great. And then when you zoom in and you see this subtle stripe here or how the colors alternate here, I just find it to be really attractive. So I have learned a lot from this project. I will continue to learn a lot from this project when I sample my different swatches, and I'll bring you along for the ride.